Good morning. Today is the 13th of March 2022, and this is a continuation of our series of anecdotes. In psychology, the repair manual that psychiatrists use to keep us all oiled and greased is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Evidently, they started putting it together in the 1950s, and in the 1970s, there was a major revision, an era that's of concern for us. Some things that used to be considered mentally ill were now considered appropriate, such as homosexuality. I'm told it didn't start then, but it's my understanding that that was the first of the era of the LG, LGBT, that sort of thing. I think they're up to 15 now. Let me stop and remind myself that the shop manual definition of mental illness is the normal taken into the abnormal, from a cold to the flu to pneumonia, and then to go backwards from pneumonia to the flu to a cold, and that the normal is normal but not good enough. To be normal is not a natural thing at all. In the end, it's a religious construct, and so it begs the question, how do psychiatrists deal with that, and how does the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual deal with that? Let me pause and remind myself of an example that I use. It's in two parts. The first part goes like this. It's the 1950s, and there's a young couple. They're in the living room in their house, and it's evening time. The kids are on the floor, and they're all watching television. The husband is enjoying a whiskey sour, and the gal is enjoying a Tom Collins. But after a few months, that jigger of whiskey and jigger of gin turns into a jigger and a half, and then two jiggers, and then two drinks. That's simply how the chemistry in the human body works, the chemistry and the psychology. Lent comes around, however, and so they quit drinking for a few weeks. They give up a few meals, like going to a gymnasium and getting back in shape, although I apologize for wording things like that way. Easter comes around, and they're back to where they were before. The second part of our example has to do with music, and music does a good job of presenting emotion. And so we're back in the 1950s, and the songs lined up the unmentionable stuff with the romance, with romancing that particular gal personally. Doris Day would sing It's Magic, and the Chantels would sing Look in My Eyes and Tell Me You Love Me or I'll Be Gone. And Edie Gourmet would sing We're Going to Get Married and Start a Family Because of Your Bossa Nova. Then there was a flip-flop. Single gals are sexier than married gals, and scummy guys, when there's plenty, are sexier than the guy that comes across with bicycles for the children at Christmas time. And so music had a profound change from the 1960s, from 1960 to 1970. The Beach Boys turned into the Beatles and Elvis Presley, and they were suave and sophisticated, or at least they came out presenting themselves as suave and sophisticated. By 1968, there were psychedelic music, and they were wearing satin shirts with fluffy collars. And by 1969, they were tripping out on LSD at Woodstock and tripping over themselves and not bathing. They never left the first person singular. The getting shoes on the kids' feet was simply out of the picture. And the social conscious, even though they would raise their hand up and say they were for peace, was actually quite self-centered. They were tearing down society and getting into all the golden real estate they could. The first part of our example represents the idea of the psychology and the chemistry inside your body causing the psychology, and the second part is the psychology turning into social psychology, turning into sociology, and turning into a change of society from the normal to the abnormal. Let me pause for a moment and continue. We're going to continue now with one of our fancy graphs, and one of our fancy graphs is to take our finger and go out to the side here, and on this side is the parish priest, and he represents this one side of our equation. I take a line and I draw it straight, and in the middle I have this big bump, and that represents the idea of original sin. The normal isn't normal at all. And then it goes out to the other side, and there's a pimp, and that represents the intellectual. It seems like everything on the one side of our fancy graph The God and country side was completely thrown out, including the idea of being normal, of being a man and a woman, of race relegated to an endearing quality of your parents, of the idea that Christ is love himself, so you will the good of another person, so you have a normal supply and demand curve, or home economics. And on the other side was the intellectuals version, with the complete absence of love, with its peasant and property class society, a small group of exceptionally rich people and a huge group of people living in poverty, and the idea that they're either a psychopath or a intellectual, depending on the point of view of the person doing the talking. Let's start to sum this up. You're listening to this, and hopefully you're joining our gang in the playground. And if you're a psychiatrist, hopefully you'll chime in or go grab them and take them on a television show or one of these computer pods and have them explain just what it is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual means. Just what do they mean when they talk about being normal and well-adjusted. If they don't take into account those three things that make up God and country, then it seems like all of psychiatry is fundamentally flawed. So we shall ask them. And that's the first thing for this anecdote. The second thing is to make an appeal for one of our gang in the playground to come up with a montage or perhaps a 2 or 3 minute video clip that presents music from the 50s up into Woodstock, from the Chantels album cover where they look like they're ready to go to church on Sunday, to the group Led Zeppelin in an album called Houses of the Holy in 1973 that simply oozed up evil, which is what they were trying to do. They were professional poetics, and that's what they were selling. And then to go backwards, to present the idea that they, at first in the 1960s, they're considered suave and sophisticated and more intelligent, but that really wasn't the case. We need some way of putting into the public conscious something that we can use to have a sense of definition. So that's two things. And of course, the other two things, if you're listening to this and you're a girl, to get into the character of a 1950s home economist, you have 4 children and 1 husband to take care of. How much of a budget do you need to get everybody taken care of? And from the point of view of a guy, how many hours do you have to work in order to provide the resources, in order to produce the goods needed to get everybody out of poverty and into plenty? And that's it. That should be enough for now. Enough for one anecdote. Thank you. We shall see you on the next anecdotes.